what does Ezekiel 38 require prophetically? It requires a dictator to dominate the Eurasian continent. It requires the territory east and north of Israel to be under Gogian control, in verses 5 and 6. A dependent Europe to fall under Gog's political control, verse 6. That the West Bank be part of Israel proper, in verse 8. That Israel be at peace both internally and with its near neighbours, verses 8 to 11. That Israel be very prosperous and envied by other nations, verse 12. That Britain will be allied with its former colonies in opposition to Gog, verse 13. And that the Arabian Peninsula states will back Britain in its opposition to Gog. Now, they're just a few things that are required by Ezekiel 38. There are many more. We want to address some of those things this evening, brothers and sisters and young people, in this second address on prophecy. Well, there is a dictator in Russia, isn't there? A man who could be in power potentially to 2024. He had an 8-year reign from 2000 to 2008. He put his puppet in power for 4 years. During that 4 years, the constitution was changed to give 6-year terms. He was re-elected, and he can be re-elected 3 times. 2024. He's still a relatively young man, and of course he's come to power in most unusual circumstances, some of which I believe is outlined in Habakkuk chapter 2. We'll talk a bit more about that in a moment. Now, you may be aware that this week Russia has made a deal with the Ukraine to dig them out of a deep financial hole. The Ukraine was looking to join the European Union, presumably to help them with their difficult financial position. But Russia, of course, didn't want that to happen. There has been riots and sit-ins in the streets, but people want to go to Europe, and Putin has told his man in Kiev, no, you're coming our way. And a deal has been signed that will lock the Ukraine into the Russian orbit until Armageddon. That's what's happened right this week, brothers and sisters, while we've been here. So here we've got a man who I believe is going to play a part. Now, whether he's the Gog, I don't know. We'll have to wait and see about that. But one thing is certain. This man has established the Gogian-style dictatorship of which Ezekiel 38 speaks. We now have that kind of dictatorship in Russia, where one man rules at the top and he rules through the secret police, and if you don't like it, well then pack up your goods because you're about to get into a box. He will make sure you disappear. It might be polonium-210 or it might be a knife, but you'll disappear, as many journalists have disappeared who have, of course, written things about this man. He's a deadly dictator. And, of course, he's all there in Habakkuk chapter 2. There's no question in Habakkuk 2, while it's based upon the Chaldean invasion of the land of Judah, and while we read in verse 4 of Habakkuk 2 about that Chaldean dictator, that this is really about the latter days. And I'll demonstrate that to you in a moment. And this is what it says in verses 5 and 6 of Habakkuk chapter 2. Towards the end of verse 5, that he gathereth unto him all nations, and heapeth unto him all people. That's a process well in train. Shall not all these take up a parable against him and a taunting proverb? And this is what they say. Woe to him that increaseth that which is not his. How long? And to him that ladeth himself with thick clay. Now, in the authorised translation, that's not a particularly good translation. It actually means, in the Hebrew, pledges of allegiance. He's got one this week from the Ukraine. He's bought them off. He's got pledges of allegiance. And that's going to happen to many other nations as time goes on, brothers and sisters. So are we dealing with a latter-day dictator here? Well, let's have a look at the context of this chapter. In verse 3, it speaks of an appointed time. I love the way that Brother Joel read that. It will surely come. And it will, the appointed time. Verse 4, the faithful have a sure destiny. The just shall live by faith. Verse 14, the earth shall be filled with the knowledge of the glory of Yahweh as the waters cover the sea. When's that going to happen? Very soon. Verse 20, Yahweh is in his holy temple. Let all the earth keep silence before him. Is that a fact in the days of Habakkuk? No. When's that going to happen? Very soon. And what about Habakkuk chapter 3? Well, it's a psalm detailing the march of the rainbowed angel, and it ends with these words, "Yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will joy in the God of my salvation." Yes, it's about the saints riding the chariots of salvation. You read that chapter. It's all about the things that are before us. Our work, brothers and sisters, in the establishment of the kingdom of God. We know that this chapter is about the latter days. And so therefore, when we read about this dictator, we're reading about the latter-day Gogian dictator that will come down into the land like this Chaldean one did in the times of Habakkuk or beyond. So what is he all about? Well, in verse 4, he's corrupt and he's an oppressor. In verse 5, he's noted for drunkenness, pride, expansionism, insatiability and dictatorship. In verse 6, he's noted for coercion and blackmail, which are his favourite devices. He's used that on the Ukraine to control other nations. In verse 8, he's ruthless in spoiling the nations and the cities and the innocent people he intends to rule. In verse 9, he uses religion to hide and to justify his actions. In verse 12, he builds his empire by fire and blood. In verse 15, he uses base practices to undermine others. And in verses 18 and 19, he's an image worshipper. Yeah, he uses religion for politics, as we're going to see in a moment. But just a word about verses 15 and 16. Now, I've said this before from this platform, so some of you will have heard this. Do you know how Vladimir Putin came to power, how he became the president of Russia? Well, in the late 90s, in the 8-year reign of Boris Yeltsin, there was a prime minister called Yevgeny Primakov who was keen to make his mark in history. It was alleged that the Yeltsin family was fiddling the books and had their finger in the till of the Russian treasury, which was true. Primakov appointed a prosecutor to investigate. The prosecutor found evidence, clear evidence, that the Yeltsin family was corrupt. This would have meant Yeltsin out of power. So what did he do? He'd just made Vladimir Putin the head of the FSB, or the KGB as it once was. He was a KGB man. So he rang Vladimir Putin and he said, "Mr. Putin, I'm in trouble. Can you help me?" And he explained to him what was happening, that was about to come out in the open. This prosecutor is going to lay this before Parliament. I'm done. Leave it to me, boss. He arranged to have a safe house, a KGB safe house near the Kremlin, set up with fridges full of vodka and the sort of stuff that Russians drink, and 2 ladies of poor reputation, harlots. And they lured this prosecutor into the safe house. And do I need to describe what happened? Well, it was played live on Russian television. End of case. End of prosecutor. Yeltsin continues until 2000. So who do you think he would give the job to? Who do you think that he would hand the nuclear case to? Well, it's pretty obvious, isn't it? The man to whom he owed a huge debt. And before the end of the century, Vladimir Putin had the satchel, and he had given guarantees to Yeltsin he would not be prosecuted, even if it came in the open. He gave him a dacha north of Moscow and a hefty pension for the rest of his life so he could drink as much vodka as he wanted. And of course, we know he died from cirrhosis of the liver. That is how Vladimir Putin came to power. That is Habakkuk 2, 15 and 16. Read it. Woe unto him that giveth his neighbour drink, that putteth thy bottle to him, and makest him drunken also, that thou mayest look on their nakedness. I won't read the next verse. Don't need to. It was on Russian television. The nakedness of the prosecutor. That's how Putin came to power. So you see, this is a very appropriate, very applicable prophecy, isn't it? Well, what about this man? He's an image worshipper. Now, here he is in 2000. He's kissing the same image that he gave to Pope Francis I just a few weeks ago, a month ago, 25th of November. He was in the Vatican. And he took down there and presented Francis with the image of the icon of the Madonna of Vladimir, very appropriately named, I would have thought, an important religious icon for the Russian Orthodox Church. Here he is kissing it in 2000. Here he is kissing it in 2013 in the presence of the Pope. He's very close to this man, by the way, too, Kirill, the new head of the Russian Orthodox Church. You know what Kirill said when he came to power? He said he's going to make the Russian Orthodox Church a Putin church. That's what he said. I'm going to make it a Putin church. So he uses religion for the sake of power. Because, of course, today you can't rule Russia unless you have the church on your side, because the populace has gone back to religion. And in hard times, that's what they do, don't they? That's why the European nations will go back to the Pope when the depression comes. That's what happens in history. Well, one final word about that. Ukraine. Where is it? Well, here it is, that broken line. That's the Ukraine. It's in the heart of the territory of ancient Rosh. The Rosh, the Rusai, inhabited this area. It's part of the land of Magog. Gog of the land of Magog, prince of Rosh, Meshech and Tubal, says Ezekiel 38, verse 2. Little wonder we're seeing the things we're seeing today, brothers and sisters. The Ukraine now locked in the Russian prison. Little wonder. I want to move now to Israel. You know, there is a contemporary view in our community that Elijah has a work to do in the land of Israel prior to the events of Armageddon. Now, we can argue, brethren will disagree about whether or not Elijah has a work in the land or whether his work's outside the land only. I'm the latter one. I believe the scripture's clear on that. Elijah's work is outside them. But let's just say that Elijah does have a work in the land. It would be totally ineffective unless it produced some results, wouldn't it? There would have to be some kind of religious revival in Israel. Well, some point to say, well, you know, the Orthodox Jews are making their mark in Israel. Yeah, pinprick mark, I can tell you. But what does the Bible, brothers and sisters, have to say about the character of Israel just prior to Armageddon? Is there going to be a spiritual reformation in Israel before Christ arrives on the Mount of Olives? The answer is no. In fact, the opposite is true. The exact opposite is true. Prophecy requires, amongst other things, that Israel will be isolated from all of its old friends. It'll have some new ones, as you'll see in a moment. But it will be isolated from its old friends, like America. That's in the process of happening now. That Israel will be very prosperous, and that prosperity will produce corruption. They'll be very corrupt, very proud, and arrogant, just before Armageddon. How do we know that? Well, we know it from prophecy, as you'll see in a moment. Now, let's just take this matter of Israel's latter-day prosperity. You know, they have depended on American money for decades. That's because for 4 decades at least, Israel had socialist governments. Socialist prime ministers, starting with David Ben-Gurion, going right through to the 80s, ruled the country. Now they don't know how to run an economy. And so Israel's economy was a basket case for 4.5 decades. So what happened? How was God going to have this prophecy about Israel's latter-day prosperity fulfilled? He did it in 2 ways. He put the right man in the job, and he allowed them to find massive quantities of oil and gas under their soil and off the coast. That's what he did. We're going to have a look at that. Ezekiel 38 verse 12 requires prosperity in Israel at the end. And it's envied by other people. I will go up to them. I will go. They're envied by other nations. And the man that God put in place, of course, was Benjamin Netanyahu, an American-educated Jew who was Prime Minister of Israel from 1996 to 1999, when nothing much happened, and then from 2009 onwards. You know, in that period when he wasn't Prime Minister, Ariel Sharon was Prime Minister for a portion of that time. And Ariel Sharon saw Netanyahu as a competitor. Do you know what he did? He handed him the poison chalice. And the poison chalice in Israel is the finance ministry. All right? Now look after that, Mr. Netanyahu. You ain't going to replace me. Well, of course, Sharon had a stroke in 2004. And in 2003, when he became finance minister, Netanyahu immediately introduced legislation into the Knesset for the entire Israeli financial system to be modelled on the Australian and Canadian model. Do you know that? They used the Australian and Canadian financial model. That's why Australia and Canada were two of the countries that came through the GFC the best. We had the right things in place to stop the collapses that occurred elsewhere. All right? That's what happened. So, what's happened to Israel's prosperity? Well, it's taken off like a rocket since 2003-4. And today it prospers in many and varied fields. In computer technology, forget about Silicon Valley. All they can do is produce silly computer games. You want some serious computer stuff? Go to Israel or India, who are very close, by the way, to Israel. Agriculture, arts, science, weapons development, oil and gas and diamonds. Did you know that every single diamond cut in the world is cut in Israel? Nobody can compete with them. They have got their hands on a whole range of things that have made them one of the most prosperous nations in the world, leave alone in the region. And of course, even though they, like all others, will suffer in the depression, they'll come through it much better. They'll come out the other side, and they will be the prosperous nation that Ezekiel 38 verse 12 and other verses require prior to Armageddon. But what's that going to produce as far as their attitude towards the things of God's concerned? Well, Ezekiel 39 tells us about that. Ezekiel 39 is about the 40 years after Armageddon, when Elijah's doing his work outside the land, bringing the Jews back. And this is what God says as they come back to the land. This is what he says about them. Therefore, thus saith the Lord God, now will I bring again the captivity of Jacob, and have mercy upon the whole house of Israel, and will be jealous for my holy name, after that they've borne their shame and all their trespasses whereby they have trespassed against me, when they dwelt safely in their land, and none made them afraid. When was that? Well, it's not today. They got the Hezbollah in southern Lebanon with 26,000 rockets that can reach the Negev. They got the Hamas in the Gaza Strip getting weapons from Libya and make life uncomfortable. They got Iran producing nuclear weapons. They got the Syrian conflict to the northeast. You reckon Israel's safe today? No. That's why they built the big wall, the 8-metre wall around the West Bank. They're not safe today. They don't feel safe, and they tell you they're not safe. But that's got to come. Peace has got to come. And I'm going to demonstrate tonight, as best I can, how that will come, prophetically. And when it comes, brothers and sisters, they'll take down their walls and their bars and their gates, as Ezekiel 38 tells us. So will they have a spiritual revival? No, says God. He's actually quoting the previous chapter, Ezekiel 38, verses 8 and 11. When they dwell safely in their land. That's in the 10-year period before Armageddon. That's the time when they most upset their God. Now, they've got a pretty good history, haven't they, this mob, this nation? They have been upsetting God for a long, long time. But never in their history do they upset him as much as they do in that period before Armageddon. There will be no spiritual revival in Israel until the Redeemer comes to Zion and turns away ungodliness from Jacob. Do you know that in the rainbow, I hate their use of that, in the rainbow crowd, that's the homosexuals of our world. That's what they call themselves. The place to go today is not San Francisco or New Orleans or Sydney in March. The place to go for homosexuals today is Tel Aviv. Yeah. Tel Aviv. And it's gonna get worse. That's why I don't believe Elijah's going to go there. He's got to work outside. He ain't got to work there. Christ will clean that up in the events of Armageddon. Their arrogance peaks in that period before Armageddon, in the latter days. Why? Well, there's many reasons. Recent massive finds of oil and gas will make Israel self-sufficient for decades. Israel attributes its success to its own ingenuity and endurance when they've been attacked by their enemies. And many of the Holocaust generation who ceased to believe in God during the Second World War when they were being fried in ovens, and they called upon God day after day and didn't get any answer, said, well, there can't be a God. And it was the atheists that God used to create the state of Israel. Did you know that the religious Jews opposed the establishment of the state of Israel? Did you know that? They actually opposed it. That comes out of the mouth of the most prominent rabbi in America. So here we've got God using atheists to establish the nation of Israel. And it's atheists who rule it today, and that's why it will remain corrupt until the end. Look at this, what they've found. Now, why did it have to take so long? This shale oil has been there for centuries, millennia. How come they didn't find it? Look at all these red dots. That's the shale oil in Israel. And out off the coast, you've got the Leviathan field and the Tamar field. There is such large quantities of oil and gas there that they will be totally independent from the rest of the world for 50 years and be able to supply oil and gas to other nations at the same time. Why? Why did this happen in the last 5 years? Well, because God wanted it to happen in the last 5 years. Because he wanted his people to be prosperous, just like the prophecy says they would be prior to Armageddon. And it's all designed to bring the nations, of course, to that day, Armageddon. It's all designed, and we're pretty familiar, aren't we, with the prophecies surrounding that matter. We're also familiar with this prophecy, Ezekiel 38, verses 5 to 7. Now, I'm not going to deal with all of that. All I really want is the first word of verse 5. Because these are the confederates of Gog, Persia. Now, this is not Iran, brothers and sisters. Iran is only portion of the Persia that Ezekiel's talking about. He's talking about the Persia of old, which was a far bigger territory. Iran's just one portion of it. We're going to have a look at that tonight. And of course, we read in verse 7 of Ezekiel 38, "Be thou prepared, Gog, and prepare for thyself, thou and all thy company that are assembled unto thee, and be thou a guard unto them." The Hebrew word means the guard of a prison. Gesenius says it means a custodian. They will be locked up by this dictatorial power, Gog, of the land of Magog, in his confederacy, that he might come down upon the mountains of Israel. I want to turn now specifically to the Syrian crisis. You know, the Arab Spring of the last 2 years, nearly 3 now, has seen upwards of 120,000 perish in Syria, many of them children. And I think most of us have seen pictures of the carnage that is going on in Syria. I don't know about you, but I find it sickening. And one of the reasons I find it sickening is because I've been to many of those places just 3 years ago. We did most of Syria. We went to Dara, and we went to all the places that are now in a heap of ruins. I mean, we stayed in some hotels that are now just a heap of ruins. And the carnage that's gone on is just unbelievable as Bashar Assad sets about to destroy his own people. And there's now, they say, nearly 3 million refugees that have escaped or are in the process of escaping from Syria. That country is on its knees, and they can't see any end to it, but the Bible can. I want to talk to you about what is going to happen with that nation of Syria and a few others to boot. Bible prophecy requires the Assad regime, which is a sworn enemy of Israel, to be quieted. That regime has got to go. Otherwise, Israel will never have peace on its northern border. Never. But it has to have peace, both internally and externally. Now it's got peace with Egypt and it's got peace with Jordan, relatively with Lebanon, except for the Hezbollah, doesn't have peace with Syria. So something's got to happen there. The Hezbollah, of course, are sponsored by both Syria and Iran. Now Syria was part of the ancient Seleucid kingdom. It was the territory called in Daniel chapter 11 the King of the North. We want to talk about that territory tonight. Now some of you have heard this before, some haven't. It's very important that we see with clarity what God has outlined for the future of this region. It's all there. It's as clear as the nose on your face if you're prepared to read the prophecies carefully and to put them together. Russia is building ties in the meantime with Israel and has offered to create a Gazprom Israel. And I want to talk about the growing relationship between Israel and Russia, because this is the way in which Israel is going to get peace. They're going to end up with an agreement with Russia. We're going to see that from prophecy, brothers and sisters and young people. Turkey, of course, also has a big part to play in future events, and they're leading the Arab League against Syria at the moment. Now, Russia has some pretty serious interests in Syria. There are two ports in which they have been deeply involved. There's the northern one, Latakia, which they put a bit of their money into developing, and they have put much of their Black Sea fleet at Latakia, or at least they had it there. Recent events have made that a bit difficult. We look down upon this place here, Tartus, from the heights that look down over the entering in to Hamath. And there was this city off on the coast. That port was built with largely Russian money. You know how many Russians were there in Syria before the civil war began? 50,000. 50,000 Russians were there because they were building that port. So Russia is interested in having ports just to the north of Israel. I wonder why. Well, Daniel chapter 11 verse 40 says, "And the king of the north shall come against him," meaning Turkey, "like a whirlwind, with chariots and with horsemen and with many ships. And they'll plunge down the coastal strip of the land of Israel," we are told in Daniel 11, but their aim is Egypt. They're going to secure Egypt first. And they're doing this with many ships and with some land forces. Little wonder that Russia has this design to have two major military ports to the north of Israel. Now here are some of the prophecies that I believe are about to be fulfilled. Syria, Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan and Pakistan, basically the Persia of Ezekiel 38 verse 5, are about to fall to Russian control. And we're going to have a look at two verses, Daniel 7 verse 7 and Daniel 11 verse 40. We'll come to those in a moment. I've got a couple of things to say before we get there. Israel will annex the West Bank and deal with Hamas and Hezbollah in order for peace to descend on the Middle East, preparatory to Gog's invasion. Now, we can say with confidence that Israel will annex the West Bank because it says in Ezekiel chapter 38 and verse 8 that Gog comes down upon the mountains of Israel. If you ever had a look at a map, you will know that the mountains of Israel run from Hebron to Gilboa, and 90% of them are in the West Bank. So Israel is going to annex the West Bank. The prophecy does not say that Gog comes down upon the mountains of the state of Palestine, which is what the Palestinians want to call it when they're given it. They will not be given it. They might get the Gaza Strip. That might be the Philistia of Zephaniah chapter 2. But they will not get the West Bank. That will become part of Israel proper. Then this. Like Ahaz in 2 Kings chapter 16 verses 7 to 9. And then later his son Hezekiah, 2 Kings 18 verses 13 to 16. Israel will doubtless have a peace deal with Russia, the Assyrian of Isaiah and Micah, as we shall see in a moment. We want to talk about that, brothers and sisters, because it's happening right now. I want to give you the evidence that it's happening right now. And Israel, of course, will remain prosperous, even through the difficult times to come. And just a bit of evidence about this Assyrian of the latter days. In Micah 5 verse 5 we read, "And this man, Christ, shall be the peace, when the Assyrian shall come into our land, and when he shall tread in our palaces." Isaiah 14:25, "That I will break the Assyrian in my land, and upon my mountains tread him underfoot." Ever read that context? It's a latter day prophecy. Isaiah 31 verse 8, "Then shall the Assyrian fall with the sword," etc. Ever read that context? From Isaiah 30 to 35, there is an absolutely wonderful framework of all the events that will occur, from Armageddon to the full establishment of the kingdom and the subjugation of all nations, including the destruction of Babylon the Great, which is the subject of Isaiah 34. Because it's quoted in Revelation 14. Magnificent context. Brothers and sisters, God could not have done more to spell out to us exactly what's going to happen, at least the framework of what's going to happen. We can't put all the details there. We may get some surprises along the way, but we know what the framework is. And I want to lay that framework in front of you. The Assyrian is the title of Gog in the latter days in Isaiah and Micah. And there are many, many passages along those lines in those two prophecies. All of this, of course, is based on the invasion of Judah in the days of Hezekiah, 2 Kings 18, which we know is a type of Armageddon. The Assyrian army was destroyed outside the walls of Jerusalem, as will Gog be destroyed outside the walls of Jerusalem. And faithless Ahaz is the type of modern Israel, who made the first pact with the Assyrians in 2 Kings 16, 7-9. He took the silver and the gold from the temple, and he sent to the Assyrians who were rumbling in the north, because Ahaz had two problems. He had one problem directly to the north, the king of Israel, and the other problem to the northeast, the king of Syria. And those two latter kings were in league, and their aim was to destroy Judah. So what does God do? In Isaiah 7, he sends the prophet Isaiah to Ahaz and says, "Look, ask of me a sign and I will save you from the king of Israel and from the king of Syria." And Ahaz said, "I won't ask any sign." He did not believe in Yahweh. This is that King Ahaz, says the record. God's exasperation with this faithless, secular king who would not seek a sign from his God. He didn't believe in him. He's an exact replica in an individual of modern Israel. The secular nation of modern Israel. And he made a peace pact with the Assyrians, like Israel is about to make a peace pact with the Russians. Now think about it. If the Russians say to Israel, "Listen, we want to be involved in your oil and gas," and they're already involved, "we'll help you with that. We know you've got limited resources, but we'll help you with that. We're pretty experienced. Gazprom, Putin owns it. All right. You've got a problem with Iran, haven't you?" "Yeah." "They're developing nuclear weapons." "Yeah." "We'll solve it for you. We will solve your problem with Iran, providing you leave us alone when we conquer the territory from Syria to Pakistan." And that's what Russia is going to do. When we take that territory, you leave us alone, Israel, we'll solve your problem with Iran. And we will leave you alone to deal with the Hezbollah in southern Lebanon and with the Hamas in the Gaza Strip. Got it? Israel will secure peace, and Russia will get what it wants. And Israel will be like Russia was in 1940, when Germany made a peace pact with Russia and said, "We'll leave you alone." And then in the summer of 1941, Hitler invaded. And Stalin, who had absolute confidence that Germany would not invade, You know what he'd done? He'd shot all his best generals because he saw them as competition to his rule. He wasn't seen in public for 2 weeks. Not one word came from his mouth for 2 weeks. He was a lump of jelly. Oh, what do I do now? We know what happened. Russia lost 20 million people. Didn't have an army for a while. Their army just got massacred. No generals to lead it. That's what happened to Russia itself. They've played this game before. They've been on the wrong side of it. They know what they're doing. That's how it's going to happen. I want to show you that. On the 13th of May 2013, a Russian warship docked in the port of Haifa. This was a report from Israel Today on the 14th of May 2013. For the first time since the establishment of the State of Israel, a Russian warship docked at the port city Haifa earlier this month. The Azov of Russia's Black Sea Fleet came to Israel at the request of the Association of Russian War Veterans to help celebrate the anniversary of the victory over Nazi Germany. Jewish veterans of the Red Army who later immigrated to Israel were invited to participate in a ceremony aboard the massive ship. Yeah, it is massive, 113 metres long. The front comes down, the back comes down. They can load troops and onto, on both ends. Just up to the shore. I'm sure they had a pretty good look around as coming into Haifa, because one day they're going to use it. The article went on like this. However, there was another even more important, even historical reason for the visit. With the looming collapse of the Assad regime in Syria, Russia is on the lookout for new Middle East alliances. Russia has long maintained a large naval base in Tartus, the second largest port city in Syria. But with Syria's ongoing civil war likely to end in that country descending into factional warfare and chaos, Russia is concerned for its interests in the region. Recent reports are that Moscow is searching for a new Mediterranean seaport to maintain strategic balance in the region. Russian delegations have reportedly examined Egypt and Algeria, but Israeli officials say that the Arab Spring has changed Russia's view of Israel, and Moscow now understands that in this volatile and unpredictable region, the Jewish state is an anchor of stability. This is how the Jews looked upon it. There are things on which we do not agree with Russia, but there is a general understanding that we defend the same principles of democracy and security, said one official in Jerusalem. Oh yeah. They share our concern over Islamic fundamentalism, that's true, taking over the Middle East. The Russians realise now more than ever that you can rely on Israel. You know what's happening there, brothers and sisters and young people? They came in ostensibly to celebrate the Russian war veterans, the Red Army war veterans. There are 10,000 Red Army veterans from World War II. How old do you reckon they are? World War II ended in 1945. How long ago is that? That's a long time. These people are in their 80s and 90s. There are 10,000 of them in Israel, amongst the 1.45 million Russian Jews that came since 1992. The traffic between Tel Aviv and Moscow far exceeds the traffic between Tel Aviv and London and Tel Aviv and New York. There are people going backwards and forwards on grandpa, grandma visits. We do that, don't we? Backwards and forwards all the time. There's a lot of Jews who've got relations in Russia. There are very real grounds for peace between Russia and Israel on many, many fronts. And the Bible says it's going to happen. The history of the times of Ahaz and Hezekiah, God says, is a pattern for the latter days. And it will happen as it has always happened, with an exactitude that we will find jaw-dropping. And it's already happening. The Russians very loudly publicised the Azov's visit to Israel and their decision to mark the victory over Nazis together with Jewish veterans. Russia is proud of its connection to this historical event and wants to remind everyone that we fought on the right side. Oh yeah, you had your agreement with Hitler in 1940. And it wasn't until he biffed you in the nose in 1941 that you changed sides. Yeah, it goes on to say this. There is something to be understood from this for the contemporary Middle East. Where we decided to make anchor is a clear statement, both to the Israelis and the entire region. Yeah, they're making a clear statement. There was a general understanding that the Azov's visit was not a one-time event and that other Russian warships would come calling in the near future. Israeli officials did not deny that they are open to further cooperation with Moscow. Guess what? It's already happened. Another Russian warship has visited Israel since the 13th of May this year. It's happening, brothers and sisters. Putin visited Israel on the 25th of June 2012. He had talks with Netanyahu. The talks had been detailed and very useful, he said. Those talks were about Syria and Iran, as well as about oil and gas. Peres, the President of Israel, visited Moscow on the 7th of November 2012 for the inauguration ceremony of the Jewish Museum and Tolerance Centre. That's interesting, isn't it? And on the 20th of November 2013, Netanyahu visited the Kremlin to discuss Iran and Syria because six nations have come to an agreement with Iran to let them do certain things that Israel doesn't want them to do, to continue to enrich uranium. So there's a problem emerging there. It'll be solved when the agreement between Russia and Israel is made. And Russia will handle the problem of Iran. Now I want to come to these two verses, Daniel 7 verse 7 and Daniel 11 verse 40. Daniel 7 verse 7 is about the fourth beast, the Roman Empire. It's dreadful and terrible and strong exceedingly. It had great iron teeth, the symbol of Rome. It devoured and brake in pieces. Yes, that was all true of its history. But never in the history of Rome did the next words that you can see in green on that screen were fulfilled. Never. That yet awaits fulfilment. It says, and stamped the residue with the feet of it. And it was diverse from all the beasts that were before it, and it had 10 horns. Never did the fourth beast stamp the residue with its feet. So what's the residue? Let's have a look at some maps. There's Babylon, Nimrod's territory, at its height in the days of Nebuchadnezzar. It was followed by Medo-Persia. Now, if you've read Daniel chapter 7 carefully, you know this. Just like this bear has got 3 ribs in its mouth, that the beast that comes after devours the one before, devours the previous empire. So when Medo-Persia came along, it devoured the Babylonian territory. When Alexander came along, his kingdom devoured the Medo-Persian territory. It was almost precisely the same territory. When the Romans came along, most of their territory was in the west. They didn't get very far to the east. Oh yeah, they got to the head of the Persian Gulf, but they couldn't hold it. And in 118 AD, it was abandoned by Hadrian. He drew back from Trajan's conquests in the east, and he created a line of forts that go through Jordan and Syria today. You can go there, stand in them. A line of forts that became the eastern border of the Roman Empire for the rest of its history. So what's the residue, brothers and sisters? Well, it's this territory. From Syria across to Pakistan. It includes Afghanistan, it includes Iran, it includes Iraq. That is the residue of the territories of the previous empires that Rome never conquered. And it says that the fourth beast will stamp the residue with the feet thereof. That's telling us something. That the fourth beast is going to be revived. Yes, and that is the role of Russia, to revive this fourth beast, to restore, as it were, the Roman Empire in the west. So it can finish the work. That is already underway. You know what it says in verse 11 of Daniel 7? It tells us that this fourth beast is destroyed by Christ and the saints. And you can't destroy something that doesn't exist. So it has to be restored. And when it is restored, it has a job to do. And that job is to stamp the residue with the feet of it. And that's not a comfortable thing. Stamping your feet on something is not comfortable for what may be underneath. This is about conquest. It's about taking control, political, military control of these countries. Now, is that the only verse that we've got? No. Daniel 11, verse 40. Students of Daniel will know that in Daniel 11 we have a detailed history of two powers. They were foreign powers. That is, they were Greek powers installed in foreign lands. When Alexander died, eventually his 4 generals divided up his territory amongst themselves, and there were 2 major territories. There was the establishment of the kingdom of the Seleucids by Seleucus, one of his generals. That was from Syria across to Pakistan, across to the Indus River. And there was Ptolemy, who established his kingdom in Egypt. The territory of the Seleucids is called by God through Daniel the king of the north. And that of Ptolemy in Egypt is called the king of the south. To be the king of the north, you have to be a foreign power occupying the territory from Syria to Pakistan. You can't bear that name scripturally until you control that territory. Here's Daniel 11, verse 40. At the time of the end shall the king of the south push at him. Stop there, because that, up to that point, has been fulfilled. In 1917, when Britain was the occupying power of Egypt, and Britain controlled Egypt from 1880-something to 1950-something, Britain was the controlling power of Egypt, therefore called the king of the south, because you have to be a foreign power occupying that territory, Egypt, to be called that. Says, in the time of the end shall the king of the south push at him. Now we're going to explain in a moment that the him here and the him here are the same power, namely Turkey, the power occupying Constantinople. I'll give you some proof about that in a minute. So the first part of this verse up to there has been fulfilled, to the word him. King of the south, push at him. That was fulfilled in 1917, when Britain pushed up against the Turks who were controlling Palestine and pushed them out. And that, of course, laid the basis for British control until the State of Israel was formed in 1948. But the second part of that verse is still future. And the king of the north shall come against him like a whirlwind with chariots. We've read that from elsewhere. This is about Russia or Gog, the occupying power of Syria, Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan and Pakistan, which is the territory of the king of the north, invading the Middle East via Turkey. Well, who is the him of Daniel 11:40? The context, of course, is always going to supply your answer. And if you go back to the verses preceding verse 40 in Daniel 11, you find that it identifies the king here as the little horn of the goat of Daniel chapter 8, verse 9. In other words, the Roman Empire ruled from Constantinople, as it was from 324 AD, in support of the papacy and the Catholic Church. And Brother Thomas wrote this in Elpis Israel, part 3, page 403. He said this: "It matters not whether they be pagan Romans, Catholic Greeks, Muslim Turks, or Greek Catholic Russians, the power that rules in Constantinople and plants its standard in Assyria is the little horn of the Assyro-Macedonian horn of the goat. But before Russia can become the horn of the goat, it has to be the king of the north." That's what this prophecy is telling us. So Gog becomes the king of the north when they take control of this territory from Syria across to Pakistan. That's the territory there in the green of the Seleucid kingdom, the king of the north of Daniel chapter 11. And only when they have that territory can they come against him. The king of the north shall come against him. That is the power occupying Constantinople, Turkey today. And then they can fulfil the rest of Daniel chapter 11 and plunge down the coastal strip of Israel and into Egypt. That, brothers and sisters, is the order. So Gog goes through many phases. Gogian power passes through several phases on its way to Armageddon. King of the North, Daniel 11:40. When the Seleucid territory is controlled, it also becomes the Assyrian, because the territory of the ancient Assyrian Empire is in that region. It becomes a little horn of the goat when it seizes Constantinople, Daniel 11:40, and re-establishes the eastern leg of the image of Nebuchadnezzar. And it becomes the cruel lord of Isaiah 19 verse 4 when it takes control of Egypt. One or two more points before I sit down and let you go. Will there be a great tribulation before Christ comes? We have people who say, yes, there will be, but no, there won't be, brothers and sisters. The problem we have is that Christ told us exactly what was going to happen. He told us that prosperity would last until the end, until he came. He said that in Luke 17, in Luke 21, in Revelation 3. He could not have been clearer about that. And we hear people say, you know, we may have to go through some difficult times. I wish that was true. We would be far better off if that was true. But it's not going to happen. We will go on like Laodicea in prosperity until Christ comes, as it was in the days of Noah and the days of Lot. So shall it be in the day of the coming of the Son of Man. What were they doing? Well, you know what they were doing. So that's our trial, continuing prosperity. The Great Tribulation of Matthew 24, of course, verse 21, refers to the events of AD 70. The context is plain about that, when 2 million Jews perished in most awful events. And AD 70 goes up to part A of verse 29 of Matthew 24. He could not have been clearer about that matter. Now, I was going to talk about the coming depression. No time for that right now. We may better fit that in somewhere else along the way. I was going to show you a clip about a book called The New Depression. Some of you have seen that one. It's a fabulous clip. And I was going to show you a 7-minute clip after this meeting about the first 12 hours. It's a fictional scenario. The first 12 hours of the financial collapse that will come. That's significant for you and me, because I don't think there's any doubt that Christ told us plainly, just like in the days of Noah and the days of Lot, who were taken out before their prosperity collapsed, that that's going to happen to us. We'll be gone. And the world will enter into that time of trouble such as never was. Brothers and sisters, I don't think there's any doubt. We're close. We are very close to the end. Let's make sure that our garments are white, washed in the blood of the Lamb, and let's be prepared for the day that all of us know will surely come.